I hasten to say that you can take this issue of the whole of government too far. One of the dangers is, if you try to connect everything to everything else all of the time, you can't. But more than that, you can start press people to everybody to sing from the same song sheet. And you need to have this collaboration. It's still got to have a way of listening to different perspectives, different areas of expertise, and drawing that in, avoiding groupthink. So this is one of the problems of taking the collaboration too far, that you can actually not listen carefully to the different perspectives.
Welcome to the Westminster Tradition podcast, where we unpack lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Danielle Elston of Good Government Advisory, and today I'm joining you from Kaurna land without Caroline and Alison today, but back again for another episode is Andrew Podger AO, who we were introduced to last time, who has a long history of service as a secretary in the Commonwealth and as the Commissioner of the Australian Public Service, and is now at ANU as an honorary Professor of Public Policy. Welcome back to the Westminster Tradition, Andrew.
Hi, Danielle.
I'm going to jump in. I know that you served at a very similar time to Sue Varden, who has had a number of episodes so far on this podcast, and one of the things we talked a lot about was the sometimes tension between policy and operations in the public service, and particularly how operational leadership can sometimes be undervalued. So, when you're applying for promotions or trying to move around the service, a sense, true or otherwise, that operational leadership is less valued than policy leadership. Sue stepped us through how Centrelink was formed and the vision for what it was meant to be, and what it was to become. And in your report to the Royal Commission, you talked about the structure, including the board, which was a reasonably unusual method of governance, and almost a kind of purchaser-provider arrangement around how they operated. And in your report, you take us on a journey of all the models that have been tried over the last 40 or so years, from integrating policy, separating it out again. It's a bit like corporate services. Embed them, they come in, they come out, they come in, they go out from the agency that delivers the service. You form your own view that the benefits of service integration can be exaggerated, and that data linkages would solve a lot of those issues. And you do make that note that egg, these are my words, not yours, but may not be able to be unscrambled at this point in the juncture. Poor service delivery is often what leads to the complaints and calls to MPs' offices and media coverage, which is how Robodebt unfolded. Do you think the political risks for public servants sit more with the service delivery than the policy parts of government?
You've covered quite a lot of things there.
I did.
We might want to
go wherever you want to go with that.
We might want to break them up into a few. Let me start on the general issue of the relationship between policy and administration, and how critical it is to have the two linked. But as you say, it's a perennial issue about how do you link them. There are times when the skill set for administration is sufficiently different and substantial that you need actually a different organisational framework. So, for example, the tax office is separate from the Treasury, and the sorts of skill sets of the administrators in the tax office are not the same as those in the Treasury, but the relationship between the Treasury and the tax office is hugely important to make any policies around revenue collecting, make sure that it actually works, and that if issues arise in administration, they're passed on to the policy people to say, there are policy consequences here that you need to fix for us. And I think the same goes for Social Security and Centrelink. And I think there is for a while we had the two in the one organisation, but even when they were in the one organisation, they were quite separate divisions operating, but they used to nonetheless meet regularly and have discussions. I think having Centrelink as a separate organisation from Social Security is a sensible operation, so long as there are processes, protocols religiously kept for maintaining the relationship. It's not purchaser provider that I'm looking at. I think that gives an impression of principal agent, that there's somebody who's superior to the other and the other just does what they're told. That's not the relationship that should be going here. It's more of a partnership between the two. And understanding the policy, people have got to understand policy is only as good as something that can be implemented. And the implementation also has got to say, we have information from our experience which might contribute to an improved policy if only you would listen to us, that we might have a better policy if only you took on board the concerns that we're experiencing. So it's a partnership, it's not purchaser provider, but it can be made to work in separate organisations. And particularly in the case of Centrelink and the tax office, the nature of the administration requires protection from ministers. That ministers should not see individual cases. So the tax office can't tell the minister of an individual tax officer, a taxpayer. That's part and parcel of their independence, because impartiality is such a central concern in the administration. In my view, is exactly the same in Centrelink. Impartiality in administration is so important, you need to have some statutory independence, a constraint on ministerial involvement.
Isn't it also true, though, that less so in tax, I don't think you tend to see that as much in MPs' offices, but that it isn't as removed as that, because people who say, I've applied for a disability pension, I seem to have all the pieces, I don't understand why, or I haven't heard back for 20 weeks, all of these types of things. And if it's not through that MP's offices, it's often through talkback radio or other mechanisms. The service part of it, so the administrative part that you're talking about, is the most public-facing part. MPs are most interested in the public-facing part for kind of obvious reasons. It's very hard to quarantine the idea of something like a Centrelink from an interest in a ministerial sense, because of the pressure they receive from the outside if the service isn't operating as it should or well.
I'm not suggesting that there's not a role for ministers and politicians in ensuring the quality of the performance of the administrating organisation, so that if in fact Centrelink is not able to get somebody on an age pension for 2 months rather than a week, that should be something they should be jumping up and down about. And to have a minister assisting the Social Security minister responsible for Centrelink is very important. But the statutory framework would clarify where the boundaries lie. And there are boundaries around the actual dealing with individuals. And because dealing with individuals has got to be an impartial arrangement. And we saw in the Robodebt case where some individual cases were politicised.
Yes.
And that, I think, is totally wrong. But the concerns a minister might have around performance of the system is absolutely legitimate and ought to be part of the dialogue between the minister and the CEO of Centrelink. So I'm sure Sue Varden met with the minister quite frequently.
Yes.
But I bet you she never met and would not tolerate a discussion around individual cases.
No, absolutely not. And I think it does get to an issue that we may get to or may not, which is part of that service provision interest of a minister should be based on really good reporting as to how well people are being served, how quickly they're being served, whether they're, how many appeals, all of the kind of things all of the tests that tell the metrics that tell you whether you are, because there will always be mistakes, there'll always be files that drop off. It's an imperfect system, and it's very clear through the Robodebt Royal Commission that they never had clear metrics, and so all you are left with if you don't have clear metrics is noise, and the noise is individual, and it comes in through these various stakeholders and all sorts of places. So when you're talking about the policy stuff, and I think I don't have it open in front of me again, but you made that recommendation that the Commissioner has made that's a passion project of mine around how you get policy agency staff to have some frontline experience because there are plenty of excellent ideas that are either impossible to operationalise, or once you take them from an idea to an operation, don't work in the way you thought they would, don't work as intended. There are a number of departments across the country doing this at the moment in all sorts of portfolios, and I work with some organisations where the front line is saying, oh God, the TOFs are coming out today, everyone's going to have to type really fast. So how you do it is also as important as the idea itself, because for instance in education, there's not an overworked principal in the country who's excited at the idea of execs from central office coming out and spending the day in a school, not because of anything other than the fact that they're very busy places, and if you are not adding value and can't get your hands dirty, then you're just potentially underfoot and in the way. So I am a full-throated supporter of Commissioner Holmes's recommendation, and you had it in your report. I'm also aware that we have to be very careful how we go about doing it, so that policy people don't become another thing for very busy frontline and operational staff to have to manage and deal with.
I agree. I agree, obviously, but you've got to do it in a respectful and sensible way, and be conscious of the impact of your presence on the poor people trying to get on with the job. Look, another thing you mentioned in your introduction on this was my comment about questioning the benefits of organisational amalgamations in order to have integrated service delivery. You mentioned, effectively, I'm saying I think it's too hard to go back and fix that now. But frankly, I think setting up DHS or Services Australia, combining Medicare and Centrelink, has uncertain benefits, and it has quite significant costs. Let me give an example. When Medicare Australia was the Health Insurance Commission part of the health portfolio, the relationship between health and the Health Insurance Commission was very close. I suspect the relationship between Service Australia and the Health Department is nowhere near as strong as it used to be. Moreover, I think the metrics for the Medicare Australia part of Services Australia are more to do with the efficiency in getting the Medicare rebates out, rather than contributing to the Health Department's concern for the cost effectiveness of our whole Medicare system. Are we putting the money where it's most needed? Are the right people getting the right types of health services? Thinking as an insurer won't be part of the metrics for the current Medicare Australia. It'll be about, are we getting the right Medicare benefits to the right people quickly? And
the transactions,
which is important, but there is a whole lot of other things that ought to be contributing to help the health department with, and I suspect that it's not able to do that as well as when it was part of the health portfolio. Taking it out of the health portfolio makes these links harder. The so-called benefit is, well, we got a one-stop shop, but do people really go into Services Australia for an integrated thing of Medicare and unemployment benefits? I suspect very rarely. And I suspect to the extent we've got benefits from tying the two together, we could do it through data linkages rather than organisationally. But that's a personal view. We're set up the thing now in this way. We've got to make it work. What we've got to then do is say, how does within Service Australia the Centrelink link to social services and the Medicare Australia link to the health department in a really good way?
That's a excellent segue, Andrew, in to talking about that cross-agency collaboration and collegiality, because organisational design in the public service, people pretend like they've found the perfect solution. We're going to all have our own HR people. No, they're all going to be in a central pool now, all of that kind of thing. Huzzah. There is no such thing as perfect organisational design, and there are pros and cons to all of them. So at the very end of the day, you end up having to work across government, in no matter what governance we put in place. So we've talked a lot about the collegiality of how you go about that in this podcast, and I think, the NPP and the DSS, DHS part of developing Robodebt was a particular example of how difficult it can be, and particularly how culturally unfashionable it is to call it out when you believe another agency is egregiously wrong. And there's lots of times where you can make a decision that impacts another agency. I mean, my experience of that is more in the state public service, in the sense where if you adjust even a minor part of a service, particularly if you reduce it, it may have a flow-on effect of an increased impact on service required from another agency. You noted that even the portfolio process focus in the budget process, where you've got to fully offset savings within that single portfolio, can be a barrier to developing the policy collaboratively. What's your view on the best mechanisms to work together collaboratively in a policy and service design sense?
Interestingly, Danielle, in some respects, notwithstanding the Robodebt case, collaboration across the Australian public service at the Commonwealth level is a lot better now than it was 25 years ago. At the height of the new public management arrangement, the framework was very much each agency is its own employer, each agency has its own set of results it must achieve. Accountability was strictly on those vertical lines of accountability, not horizontal. And I think you saw in the early 2000s a shift in the terminology. We started to talk about whole of government in Australia. The Canadians talked about horizontal management. The Brits talked about joined up government. But the sense that we need to link
No wrong door, I've heard.
Yeah, that's
other
another
places.
one. So I think in a sense we have seen some shift and an improvement in that. I hasten to say that you can take this issue of whole of government too far. One of the dangers is, if you try to connect everything to everything else all of the time, you can't. But more than that, you can start press people to everybody to sing from the same song sheet. And you need to have this collaboration. It's still got to have a way of listening to different perspectives, different areas of expertise, and drawing that in, avoiding groupthink. So this is one of the problems of taking the collaboration too far, that you can actually not listen carefully to the different perspectives. Which brings me that the vital role of the cabinet process, that the cabinet has all the ministers around the table, and cabinet submissions are carefully prepared with coordination comments, so that you've got the different perspectives all put there and carefully considered, and that cabinet is able to take decisions right across the board and prioritise right across the board, having listened carefully to all the different viewpoints. So that cabinet process is enormously important.
Cabinet really is the only formal collaborative. We have all sorts of fora and all sorts of things, but cabinet is the formal whole of government process, and can be underrated as an opportunity, I think, partially because of what we're talking about here, which is collegiality, which is it can be seen, and in different jurisdictions and different governments it varies culturally, but it's bad manners to put counter advice to Cabinet when you are commenting on Cabinet submissions?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I had concern about a few years ago was when, I think it was under the Rudd government, it seemed as if the system of coordination comments was being diluted and people discouraged from using coordination comments to put on the table very firmly different views. I think Cabinet having access to different views is so important for them to be able to take informed decisions.
I agree.
And they've got to respect the fact that there will be differences of view based on different priorities and different perspectives.
And that's okay.
Different objectives. That's all fine. It's part and parcel of what responsible government's all about. And the budget process, similarly, the reason one of the core benefits of a comprehensive budget system is that around it forces the government to prioritise across everything. It's got the whole of the operations of government in one place and say, what are our priorities, and get it right. So that budget process linked to the Cabinet process is hugely important. The concern I raised in my report to the Robodebt Royal Commission was that one of the techniques used in that budget process, increasingly by the Commonwealth, but I suspect it's happening at the states level as well, is what we call portfolio budgeting.
Yep.
So early on in the process, the senior ministers will say, for this portfolio, the net budget result will be X $1 billion, that you've got to live within that. And that might be a cut of $500 million, or it might be an expansion of $1 billion. We've taken a view, and now you've got to come back and say, within that envelope, what are you going to be proposing? And if you want to propose something new, you've got to offset it entirely within that envelope.
Yeah.
Now, all that has got a logic to it. It's giving to portfolio ministers and their support ministers the responsibility to say, how do we prioritise within our area? What are we going to do as trade-offs here? And then we'll come back to the centre and help the centre do the overall prioritising, because we've done a little bit already. All that makes sense, so long as the setting of that budget cap was actually done in a properly informed way. Mm-hmm. And that's the question, whether that is being done as well. Now, in the case of poor old DHS, they have been trying to get money for their computers for decades. And every time they get told, oh, well, you can get it if you can find savings.
Find it.
Where do they go for savings? They go for savings via compliance. So the issue of Robodebt chasing compliance as an area of savings was not new. They've been doing it since the 80s, that I recall. And it becomes sillier and sillier because it gets more and more manufactured until sometime some idiots in DHS said, have we got an answer for you? Here's this wonderful one, totally against the policies of social security and helping people most in need. And it was driven by this system, not only of a government that wanted to screw down welfare payments anyway, but by a budget process which forced this to a significant level. So my concern is not to say get rid of portfolio budgeting, but to have a much more careful way of clarifying it and allowing voices from within DHS or Services Australia say, we really have a serious problem there. We can't deliver the offsets, but we do need the computer systems, and you've got to listen to us at some point and give us a go. And that's not happening under the portfolio budgeting. Now, obviously, where you started from was the issue of collaboration, and clearly the collaboration between DHS and DSS was abominable, totally in absence. And there's a cultural issue there involved. Now, how do we address that? There's no easy answer, but one of them is about the performance management, including of secretaries and the processes of appointment of secretaries, that there's information available about, from 360 degree or whatever, information that tells you about their behaviours and arrangements as well as their technical competence.
I mean, the Westminster system is inherently siloed, and we spend lots of our time trying to honour it and then work together at the same time. So it's a constant tension of public sector leaders. And if you are particularly ambitious, your success depends on a pretty straight line up to your minister, to your secretary and your minister, and how well you are performing. You get very little back insofar as promotion, if that's what we're talking about, from helping out another department, another secretary, another minister. And so, I mean, you saw that a little bit in DSS and DHS, which was they were very happy and satisfied in the line management of DSS and DHS with their own people, but there's no incentive to, I suppose, be good for another agency. So it is culturally very difficult to do, and it's really hard to sit at a table and criticise colleagues or say that the program that they're building might not be effective across agencies. And I think it is something that we have to work a little bit harder on without ending up with some completely whole of government, approach to everything because of what you said before, which is the nature of needing specific advice. But it is a very, very challenging thing to do across government.
One of the issues here is, of course, the balance between you're working for your minister and you're working for the government. Now, at the Commonwealth level, the Prime Minister makes secretary appointments. The process involves consultation with the relevant minister, but the minister does not decide. I think that varies from state to state.
Jurisdiction to jurisdiction, yeah.
But I think that process, in the book I wrote, I talked about working with the minister and then working with the real boss, the Prime Minister. And because my future standing was more in the hands of the Prime Minister than the Minister. And my experience under different governments is that my minister would sometimes, I can remember one of my ministers said to me, you are more concerned about the head of Prime Minister's department than you are about me. And I was a little bit taken aback by that. But the issue was I had to take into account both because I had responsibilities to the government as a whole as well as to my minister. And my minister had to appreciate that as part of my responsibilities. Most ministers did accept that, but there was a balancing involved. But the performance management system that the Commissioner and the head of PM&C ought to be managing ought to take into account how well I collaborate with my colleagues as well as how well I work with my minister and how well I performed in running my department.
You talked about that computer system that DHS had been desperate for some time, and that's in some ways the kernel that starts Robodebt. We've often reflected on the technological advances that Alison, Caroline and I have seen in 20 or 30 years. Before I ask about technology though, tell me, what was technology in the ABS like in 1968?
Well, in fact, in the 1960s, ABS was one of the pioneers of the use of computers and mainframes, along with Tax Office and the DSS. And it had, for its time, a pretty sophisticated use of computers. Now, you've got to remember that the world was a different world back then. And the classic example I use to illustrate that is that the bottom two levels in the public service now, APS 1s and 2, comprise about 5% of the public service. The equivalent back then would have been about 70% of the public service.
Yeah.
So 70% has become 5%, and the biggest single driver is technology change. We no longer have typing pools and all sorts of things that have totally changed. So it was a different world. But to the extent of the time of the technology at the time, the Commonwealth Public Service actually was pretty good. it invested, for example, it had a programmers in training program, and it recruited people from around the world as experts to be in their programming areas and computer areas. So it actually did very well. If I look a bit later, the 80s, the Commonwealth didn't do a bad job in shifting towards the use of personal computers. Individuals having screens, all of that sort of thing didn't exist back in the 60s, but the change in the 80s led to a big change in the structure of the public service. We led to multi-skilling arrangements and all of that sort of thing. So I think while people can be critical of the public sector, in fact the public sector in Australia has done not too badly in the use of technology and getting it right. I think Thodey is right, however, that right now we need to invest a lot more heavily in it. And if we don't invest heavily in it, we're going to miss opportunities for big improvements in the delivery of services.
So that probably is a segue in relation to Robodebt. Our listeners are pretty clear about how the failure occurred, and we've talked a lot, not just in Robodebt, but in the post office, about ICT procurement and rollout, and how leaders can struggle with the technical details, and how properly led ICT projects are so important. Your submission your report covers something similar but a little broader, which is the governance that's required. Can you tell me a little bit more about your views on the governance and where human decision-making fail-safes are required and where public interest might be embedded in that governance?
There are a couple of levels to this. First of all, it's really important that technology doesn't itself become the central driver. That it's a tool. That the technology experts think that they are the ones who are in the driving seat. The driving seat has got to be your business objectives, and what you're trying to achieve, and your policy aims, and all of that has got to be your driver. And then you use technology as a facilitator, and the best way of doing it. Dennis Trewin, the former Australian statistician, wrote an article a couple of years ago from a seminar that I helped to organise, talking about the Bureau's stats experience in this. And it's a very good article because it sets out some really important suggestions in a ticker box of what you need to do. And critical to it was that the executive of the organisation has to be in control and set what the business requirements are, and then to utilise the technology and to think very carefully about how to use that technology, and when to use waterfall type projects and when to use agile improvements in technology, things of that sort. That it's something that has to be driven from the centre rather than let the technology take control. So that's one agenda. The other one, which was more my focus in that report to the Royal Commission, was to think very carefully about the rights of the public, customer, client, call it what you will, what their rights are when things are being done in such an automated way. And things like having a governance arrangement which ensures that the client has the right to a human decision maker. That there is transparency in the algorithms being used, and that they are open, therefore, to external third parties, say peak organisation oversight and commentary. So the governance around that, to understand the rights of the individual and we are serving them in this process, was what I was getting at.
It's again, similar thing with some of the other ICT-related failures and fiascos in the public service. There are checks and balances in the development and monitoring and oversight of government programs. We have constantly flagged but not done an episode yet in relation to Robodebt of where was audit, where was risk, where was the risk committee. We all know that the Ombudsman process played out and was not effective for various reasons. But how did Treasury and Finance not inquire about the increasing cost to administer and then the lower than expected recovery, one of our observations is that it was hard to find by the people who are supposed to catch failures in the public service because it was never a reportable category. So there was never an internal report on the number of Robodebts, the number of AAT. There was no report that covered the systemic nature of the program. So it was much more easily hidden in that sense. Does that on its own explain for you how the systems that were designed to catch systemic failures and highlight them did not do that?
Well, let me start by saying that my own reflection on the Robodebt Royal Commission's report is that Finance and Prime Minister's Department got off a bit lightly.
I'd agree with that. Yep.
That's particularly around the original processes in 2015, but flowed on to the subsequent budget processes in particular that occurred. Now, I hasten to say that Finance did actually oppose the proposal when it came to Cabinet, and they argued that they were not persuaded that the measure would deliver the savings and that it was somewhat contrived. What was not clear, however, was exactly what their view was then, and the extent to which they then questioned issues around the lawfulness and so on. None of that seems to have been covered in the process. They just simply questioned whether, in fact, it would deliver the savings claimed, but it didn't really look at, well, why do you think you could get this amount of money? What are you assuming in your measuring of incomes and so on? All of that. There wasn't any sophisticated examination of that coming from Finance, though, as I say, they did oppose the proposal, but not necessarily from the point of view of concern about the clients. It was more saying, would this actually deliver the money you're claiming you can deliver? There was reporting, but the reporting was focused on the amount of savings achieved. So they were monitoring the savings coming through, and that was the total focus. But there was no discussion or reporting around other risks of the process. And as you say, no reporting of things like coming from the AAT cases or any of that. And so you are right to ask some questions about, well, where was internal audit on this? What role did it play? I don't know. I didn't cover that in my report. Perhaps I should have. There was an issue around internal audit roles as well. But all the reporting that was being done was focusing on this level of savings and how to please ministers and achieve their political and budgetary aims. Nobody was reporting more objectively on what was happening around the process, and a more objective framework for reporting was clearly what was needed. Now, it's also important to acknowledge that DSS knew there were fundamental problems. And DHS were hearing that there were problems occurring. They saw the AAT cases, and they were responding to the AAT cases in a way to try and ignore the information that was actually being fed to them. So I don't think the lack of reporting itself was the central problem. The central problem was nobody was listening, and indeed, in the case of the Ombudsman, who was deceived, and he should have stood up more. But
yes,
you may have a point about the internal audit, but for the most part, there was an active refusal to listen to what was there anyway.
I mean, I think when we have these failures, we go back to the source, which is the correct thing to do, and we have royal commissions and we figure out what went wrong. One of the things that I think would be valuable going forward is we do have these systems that are supposed to catch these things, and we need to, at the same time as figure out how it went wrong in the host agency, figure out how everybody missed it. And there are, as I said, there's supposed to be the oversight of them. I think the one that was covered extensively was the Ombudsman, but there were other spots where alarm bells should and could have been very loudly ringing.
And there could have been...
And I know that the new ART Act provides for a whole new set of powers for the tribunal and referral powers for patents and that kind of thing.
And the Robodebt Royal Commission did recommend some strengthening the way the AAT findings are relayed into the public service systems. So recommendations there. I mean, there were failures also at the ATO in terms of not appreciating the misuse of the data that they were providing, and the fact that it wasn't in line with long-standing protocols for the use of, the sharing of that information.
There was a whole heap of quiet people, Andrew, who suddenly became very, very unable to speak. You are a former Commissioner of the Australian Public Service, and all jurisdictions have public sector commissioners, public service commissioners. They've got varying roles and statutory powers. Some are very industrial, some focus more on cultural leadership. You expressed in your report and other submissions to Thodey, etc., strong views about the roles of the APS Commissioner and what its functions and powers could and should be and what impact a change would have. Can you tell us more about that?
In the Thodey report, he recommended quite a lot of strengthening of the role of the Public Service Commissioner. And he suggested that the Commissioner should be seen as what he called the head of people, and the head of Prime Minister's Department should be still the head of the service. I would always thought we should go further. I'm actually drawing on the language in the Public Service Act, which sets out what the responsibilities of the Commissioner are, and talks very much about promoting the professionalism of the public service and its capability. All of that's very clearly set out in the legislation. So my view is that why don't we just call the Commissioner the professional head of the service, and that the head of PM&C is really the operational head, or to use a term that some states have used in the past, the Coordinator General.
Yes.
Helping the Prime Minister and the Cabinet achieve what they want to achieve, and all that coordination arrangement is rightly the role of the head of the First Minister's Department. But the professional head, looking at the values and the capabilities and all of those sorts of things, should be led by the Commissioner. Now, what that would lead to, of course, is that for secretary appointments and other agency head appointments, it would be the Commissioner who takes the lead in giving advice. Now, they might have the head of the First Minister's Department involved, but it wouldn't be led by the First Minister's Department. Now, that's become increasingly important, because the head of the First Minister's Department in lots of jurisdictions, including the Commonwealth, is very frequently somebody who's got a personal relationship with the Prime Minister. They may not be directly partisan, but they're darn so getting closer to that than they might have been in the past, in a long past.
And they turn over, I would, without having data in front of me, I would say they turn over at a higher rate than most secretary level roles.
Well, particularly you see them turn over when there's a change of government. A change of Prime Minister, and all of a sudden there's a new head of the Prime Minister's Department, which means, in my view, that they're the wrong person to be leading the other appointments. They might have a say in it, but they should not be the lead. And indeed, personally, I would like to see the jobs advertised and have a committee of 3 chaired by the Commissioner, so to a few more voices and a bit more information around the process. So that's what I've been pushing very hard. So it's consistent with Thodey, but taking it a bit further. And I think the case for going further is made stronger by the nature of the way we are appointing heads of Prime Minister's Departments these days.
A question very much without notice, just as I was thinking about it then. You were a commissioner of the APS who had headed up the health department, and previous to that had senior roles in defence and administrative services. You weren't a HR professional, you weren't a people professional in a kind of degree in organisational design or anything like that. Did it matter when you were the commissioner? Because what you do tend to see is these roles across the country are often, the pipeline for that type of CE role comes up through a corporate, not necessarily a corporate part of experience, as opposed to a running an operational or a front end service. Did not having that background help or hinder you when you're in the role?
I think it's really important that the Commissioner has got standing with the peers, and that standing is most is best handled if they have been a secretary themselves. So if they're advising on secretary appointments or the performance manager of secretaries, having been a secretary is a huge part of their credibility. If they haven't been a secretary before, I think they're starting off from a very difficult position. And there have been several commissioners who haven't, and I've spoken to a few of them, and they agreed that it made their job a lot harder to be listened to, because they didn't have the standing at the point of being becoming commissioner. But you are also right that the nature of the role of the commission, HR issues are very important, and so I would, if I was out looking for an appointment to the commissioner job, I would be looking to what work they've done, which indicates a good understanding of HR management issues. So, with all great respect, I think I was able to demonstrate that myself. I think the work I'd done had been, a reasonably strong manager and reasonably well known in my management of people. I was not as good a people manager as, say, a Tony Ayres or some others. That wasn't my strongest capability. Was actually policy and policy analysis. But nonetheless, I had shown sufficient interest and experience in management issues to help me in that job as commissioner. I think it would be useful if the person had both, reasonably strong HR management skills and proven experience, as well as having been a secretary or equivalent.
No, it's an interesting, what we look for in senior people is interesting across the board. I just wondered about that.
The other
reflecting on my early... Yeah.
Sorry. The other point I'd make in this, which is a recommendation from Thodey, which I strongly support, and the relevant minister, Katie Gallagher, in a speech just before Christmas, indicated that they were heading down the same direction, but they haven't done it yet, is that the commissioner appointment should be subject to consultation with the Leader of the Opposition. And that would make it very clear then the non-partisanship, impartiality, values-based role that the Commissioner plays. I was disappointed that the current government did not consult the current Leader of the Opposition on the latest Public Service Commissioner appointment. My strong suspicion is that the Leader of Opposition would have supported the appointment. But it was a missed opportunity to demonstrate the new role we're looking for from the Commissioner, not to have spoken to the Leader of the Opposition about the appointment.
No, I agree. Reflecting on my early days as a graduate in the Department for Health in 2001, I recall your emphasis was on service and integrity. So after what was a pretty serious process to recruit us that had many steps over many months, and I think it was one of the very early days of online testing before group interviews flown in Melbourne and all sorts of things, you gave a pretty rousing speech to our cohort about how we were the best and the brightest, and we had a responsibility ability to use that in the service of others. Now, to be perfectly honest, the cultural Catholic in me found that message pretty easy because that was the same message I'd received most of my life. I don't have any memory of you mentioning the portfolio, the department, our priorities, what we needed to focus on delivering. It was all about what it meant to be in the service. So I haven't stood in a room of graduates for a little while, not for too long, but not for a little while. But I don't think, with respect to my many secretary and CE colleagues, I don't think that their speeches would be like that. I think they'd be more specific about the job and the priorities of the government or the department and what needed to get done, and less about values and less about the service almost as a vocation. How do you perceive the evolution of these fundamental principles in today's public service landscape? And do you think young people resonate with that values message or a more transactional and specific message about their job?
Very interesting to hear you say this, Danielle. I don't recall, but I suspect I suspect that episode tells you more about me than it does about anything else, about my own priorities.
Don't worry, I checked with some of my former grads and they couldn't remember anything, so I felt very proud that I could remember sitting in that room.
But I mean, it reflects my strong attachment to the institution and its institutional role, part of the democratic system and responsible government. And I believe it's terribly important that people joining the public service understand that institutional role and value it in that process. Now, if I had been running the Bureau of Statistics, I probably wouldn't have done it that way. If I was in a state Department of Education, I probably wouldn't have done it that way. So I think I took the view that this was a group of people joining the Department of Health as one of the important policy departments of the Commonwealth, and it was important that they understand the institutional role of the Commonwealth in the public service as much as they understood on the role of health. I guess I assumed that they would get to understand more about the job and health as they got experience in the job. Do young people have the values orientation that I was talking about today? I suspect that they do. I mean, maybe they're a bit more transactional, but personally, I see amongst young people an altruism, a wanting to serve. All those things I think are still there. I think if I was running a department today and trying to encourage good people to apply to be a graduate, what would the selling points be? I doubt whether my selling point would be the detailed administration of the health department. I think I'd say this is an opportunity for you to serve the nation and serve the people. Here's a chance to do jobs that make a difference. I think that would still be a telling recruitment factor.
Oh, I completely agree with that. And to be fair, whilst I remember it very clearly 25 years later, I spent as much of my career out of the services unit. So even though it resonated, there are more than one way to serve is the other element to it. So I think it's interesting, and I think it would be valuable for us to have more of those. I think you tend to hear them a lot in leadership. So when you're a leader in a service, you are in more rooms of thinking and where there's talk about what the purpose is. I think there is less opportunity for our recently joined, often younger public servants to hear those big messages of service, and we should look for more opportunities. And we get that feedback from listeners of the podcast about how do I find the time to talk about the thinking.
I think at the Commonwealth level, that message is still being conveyed quite strongly. The Public Service Commission is actively involved in agencies' induction programs, and they will be ensuring that that side of things is passed on. Maybe not quite the way I did it, but it would still be an important part of their induction for all graduates at the Commonwealth. I don't know what's happening at the state jurisdictions, whether their commissions are doing anything similar.
I'm a close observer but an outsider to APS reform, and I have a pretty simple question on this one to kind of wrap up, Andrew. What's taking so long? Seems like there's been roadmaps in Thodey. The Robodebt RC reports were very clear, and yet action seems pretty thin on the ground from the outside. And when action does happen, they've rolled out a bit of new ethics training recently, all seems a bit limp even when it does happen. What's the barrier? What's taking so long?
I don't know. I'm very worried. We seem to be seeing not the Thodey on steroids that some talked about 2 years ago, but Thodey on Valium. It worries me that it's now...
depressing, and so how I feel.
It's now 9 months since the Robodebt Royal Commission reported, more than 9 months. And the Royal Commission itself only had 11 months to do its job. Yet they provided a confidential report of what ought to be done about allegations of misbehaviour, but we don't even know the individual names 9 months later, let alone anything more that's happening, which I find really strange. It may be, and we've had introduction of an amendment bill for the Public Service Act.
Yes.
But it leaves out all the important Thodey stuff. It's not there. The Minister, just before Christmas, committed that there would be more of the Thodey stuff sometime, but we don't know where or how or what the processes will be. Perhaps the Albanese government is especially cautious of this, as in other things, pursuing reform through what is being called tranches, and with big reform will be held over until it's hoped for next term of office. But I fear in this area that's not actually where the problem lies. The problem lies that the senior echelons of the APS leadership isn't driving things the way I thought they would. And that's what's surprising me and disappointing me. This is a once-in-a-generation chance for serious reform, and it needs to be aggressively pursued. If we miss this one, we won't get another chance for a long time. And with Robodebt and these other issues around, with a parliament, with a whole bunch of members there on an integrity agenda, now is the time to move. And I'm very sad that we're not moving anywhere near as fast and firmly enough as we should.
That's both a depressing and a hopeful note to finish on, Andrew. I mean, I think our listeners have a deep and abiding commitment to reform and improvement, and that's why one of the reasons they're here. And so I still have hope, but I do find the pace of change terrifyingly slow. We have barely scratched the surface of your experience and your writing, so I'd love to have you back later in the year. I finally got my hands on a copy of the Coombs Royal Commission report into the public service from 76. Could not get a hard copy version anywhere, so had to manipulate the PDF and have a printed and bound copy. So I've got my Thodey next to my Coombs, and I think there'd be some very interesting conversations about from 76 to 2000 and whatever it was, 18, 19, how did the public service change, and what observations also were current the entire way through. So we are very grateful to have had you on the Westminster Tradition podcast, and I am hopeful that we will have you back for our listeners later in the year. Thank you so much.
I'm very happy to talk later in the year about the Coombs report. and comparing it to the Thodey report, Coombs was a far more substantial exercise, much more weighty, many more documents, a lot of research around it, much more material than the Thodey report. And frankly, I suspect we actually need a repeat of a Royal Commission rather than just the Thodey report.
Well, that's a fascinating hanger-on for later in the year. Thank you so much, Andrew. Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. Those of us in the employ of the state government speak in a strictly personal capacity, consistent with the Public Sector Code of Ethics that permits public servants to promote an outcome in relation to an issue of public interest, in this case, the betterment of the public service. Nothing we say should be taken as representing the views of the government or our employers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.